Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure. Look up. Two suns hang in the void, one gold, one blue, casting twin shadows across the hull of the Galactic Commonwealth Assembly Station. It doesn't orbit a planet. It commands space itself. This is no ordinary station. It's where empires end with signatures and wars begin with eye contact. Step inside. The air tastes sterile, but beneath it, layers of tension. You'll hear the scrape of armor from reptilian envoys, the hiss of breathing masks from ammonia breathers, and somewhere in the distance, a chorus of neural translators adjusting mid-conversation. Every corridor here has a memory, a compromise carved into steel, a secret behind every sealed door. They say peace is just war in slow motion. Here, that motion is orchestrated. But today the Assembly's pulse shifts, not for a treaty, not for an emperor, for something. Older, rawer, a name whispered through encrypted channels. A human, forgotten by politics, remembered by fate, and the Assembly just called him home. He sat in the shadow of a decommissioned freighter, jacket unzipped, one boot unlaced, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of synthebrew that hadn't tasted like coffee in years. You'd miss him if you walked past. Just another spacer, another burnout. But look closer. There's a weight behind those eyes, not sadness, strategy. The kind of stillness that only comes after you've watched too many. People die under orders that came too late. Or too clean. Elias Vance wasn't always a ghost. Once he wore the badge of a human diplomat. Trusted, respected, believed. Until he didn't. Until a peacekeeping op on Varel 7 went sideways, and he came back carrying the weight of 50,000. Lives and a sealed report no one wanted to read. Since then, he vanished, left the council, the core, the cause. Now he ran defense contracts, cheap ones. The kind where survival meant keeping your mouth shut and your heart colder than space. And, just when he thought the galaxy had forgotten him, it whispered his name again. No medals, no monument. Not even a footnote in the peace archives. The official record says the Waishari superweapon on Kareth'Vaan self-destructed during retreat. An unfortunate malfunction, a fortunate outcome. But here's what really happened. One human. No backup. A half-dead exosuit, a stolen access code, and a 30-minute countdown on a doomsday device that could hollow out a planet. He didn't wait for approval, didn't ask for orders. He went in, sabotaged it, barely got out alive, and then disappeared, not because he wanted to be forgotten, but because forgetting was easier than what came next. Debriefs, politics, tribunals. They would have spun it, buried the context, hung someone for protocol violations, maybe him, maybe someone else. So Elias Vance vanished like a ghost into the outer systems, believing, no, hoping, that no one would ever put the pieces together, because being a forgotten man was better than being a symbol, until now. Until someone remembered, and across light years the signal lit up, Ash-bearer located, initiate the right. They arrived without warning. The docking bay had seen its share of strange. Visitors, drifters, scavengers, freighter captains, with more limbs than morals. But these figures didn't walk in. They parted the space around them like gravity itself bowed in acknowledgement, obsidian armor, etched in glowing flame runes, eyes veiled behind ritual helms, scrolls clutched in clawed gauntlets, not digital but alive with shifting embers. Vance felt it before they spoke. The way silence turned sharp, the way the maintenance drones froze mid-cycle, even the lights dimmed. Then one stepped forward and unfurled the scroll. No sound, no preamble, a single title, spoken in a dialect forgotten by all but the stars. Ash-bearer. Not commander. Not human. Ash-bearer. A title no one should have remembered because he'd never claimed it. You are summoned, the voice rasped, not with threat, but with inevitability. To the Tri-Council of the Kareth'Vaan. The rite begins. Vance tried refusal, laughed it off, backed away. They didn't draw weapons, they didn't need to. The flame on the scrolls flared, and space itself locked around him. Something ancient had awakened, and it had his name written in fire. The Assembly. Chamber wasn't built by humans. It wasn't even built for them. Vaulted ceilings of living stone shimmered with embedded starlight. The floor pulsed with heat signatures of ancient battles, stored as memories beneath the tiles. Vance stood in silence as 3 Kareth'Vaan elders, cloaked in ceremonial ash grey and draped in solar iron, pronounced his fate. Not with emotion. Not with malice, but with absolute certainty. The Ash-bearer has fulfilled the binding act. He has altered the fate of a sovereign world. The crowd rippled. A few whispered. Most watched like statues. He hadn't just saved Kareth'Vaan. He had activated a vow older than modern law, older than the Assembly, older than galactic consensus. The blood binding. A pact forged in ancient warfires. When a planet is saved by an outsider, the savior becomes one of them, claimed, not thanked. The law could not be undone, not by the elders, not by human diplomats, not even by him. He was no longer just Elias Vance. He was the Ash-bearer, and his presence was not ceremonial, it was binding. Honor, it turned out, was a prison with golden bars. Vance thought they'd hand him a plaque, maybe name a crater after him, then let him vanish again. But the Kareth'Vaan had other plans. 2 figures waited beside the tri-council dais, noblewomen bound by ritual to the Ash-bearer, Lady Syleth, a warrior whose gaze cut sharper than her blades, and Voice Lira'Yen, whose calm masked the weight of ancient prophecy. Their presence wasn't for show. He wasn't being honored. He was being absorbed. The pact demanded more than titles. It demanded companionship, guardianship, and cultural integration. A sacred bond, forged through survival and sealed in fire, lifelong, public, permanent. He tried to protest. They told him he could try, but his refusal would dishonor the entire Kareth lineage. And in this court, dishonor wasn't political. It was a declaration of war. The docking port hissed open, and for a moment, silence replaced atmosphere. Vance stepped through with the slow, deliberate gait of a man both underdressed and overexposed. Around him moved the Kareth'Vaan honor guard, 8 towering figures clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered like obsidian under flame. Their formation was too precise, too practiced. This wasn't protection. It was procession. The station's central plaza rose into view, all arches of mirror stone and pressure field glass, with twin suns casting braided shadows across the floor. Eyes watched from every level, whispers slithered through translator fields. The human, the Ash-bearer, he's smaller than I imagined. Cameras floated like insects in orbit, each feeding footage to news feeds, propaganda cores, and, most dangerously, galactic memory. He wasn't being greeted. He was being enshrined. Even his footsteps echoed differently here, as if the station itself was waiting for his next move, ready to record it forever. Vance gritted his teeth. The armor of cynicism still held, but the weight of history was crawling up his spine, and it didn't care if he liked it or not. They waited at the end of the ceremonial corridor, 2 women framed by cascading banners of fire-threaded silk, each marked in the language of star oaths and bloodline archives. The first, Lady Syleth, did not bow. She sized him up like a strategist examining a faulty weapon. Her armor was stripped of ornament, scored by combat, not ceremony. She had the eyes of someone who'd fought for every right she owned, and now had to share it with a stranger. No smile, no warmth, only the chilling weight of reluctant duty. Beside her stood Voice Lira'Yen, adorned in robes that shimmered like molten dusk. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered just a moment too long. She spoke with a reverence that seemed less personal and more prophetic. You arrived on the flame's breath. As it was written, they weren't here to choose him. The choosing had already happened. By right, by law, by something older. They represented fire and ash, Syleth, the execution of duty, Lira'Yen, the whisper of destiny, and between them stood Elias Vance, unarmed, unready, and already claimed. Ceremonial armor had never felt like a trap before, but then Elias Vance had never been dressed for binding. The hall of flame-bound witnesses stretched for kilometers, vaulted with light, humming with legacy. Every step he took cracked through the silence like thunder. At the center waited the ash rings, 6 loops of living alloy, forged in fire, encoded. With memory and unknown to him, nano-locked to his biosignature the moment he stepped onto the station. When they were placed upon him, they didn't rest against his skin. They sank into it. The pain wasn't sharp, it was ancient, a heat that touched marrow. rewriting the language of his cells until every part of him pulsed with a name he hadn't chosen. Ash-bearer. Above, holocausts streamed the ritual to half the galaxy. He saw his own face, stoic and haunted, projected. 10 stories high, his eyes shadowed by something no one else could read. Resignation, they called it honor. But beneath the gold and glowing light, he saw what this was. A claim, a contract, and the truth came swift and cold. Refusal wasn't just dishonor, it was destabilization. It would nullify centuries-old treaties, fracture alliances, possibly incite war. He wasn't just bound by law. He was chemically woven into the outcome. The moment the cameras blinked off, so did the pretense. Vance tore off the upper ceremonial plate and hurled it against the wall of the diplomat's holding chamber. It clanged once, then skidded across, the floor like a dying satellite. He paced, fumed, then finally sat, jaw locked, eyes staring at the cold glow of the room's data console. He filed a protest, invoked the Inter-Civil Code on Ritual Autonomy, filed under Human Identity Clause, Subchapter 4, Cultural Exemptions, denied. The reply from the Galactic Legal Corps came in the most polite but immovable wording imaginable. Local law, if predating, assembly unification and recognized by the Tri-Civil Codex, supersedes foreign exemption. Translation: Kareth'Vaan law was older, deeper, and completely binding. He wasn't just caught in a ritual, he was enshrined in it. A symbol, an icon, a story now told in real time. And symbols, he realized bitterly, didn't get the luxury of opinions. They just had to shine when told, or burn. The war hall was empty except for echoes and anger. Syleth stood across from him beneath the arch of crossed banners, each one marking a clan lost in the First War. Her expression was steel, set to boil. "You shouldn't have saved us," she said flatly. "You shouldn't have been able to." She wasn't yelling. It would have been easier if she had. "You stumbled into our history like a drunk into sacred fire. You didn't earn that disruptor code. You didn't plan a strategy. You just did what humans do." Vance bristled. "You're angry I acted." "I'm angry we have to live with it," she snapped. "That we're bound to honor you by law older than memory. That I was overruled in council because some spiral-damned prophecy found you sufficient." Silence held between them like drawn weapons. Then she stepped close, too close. The ceremonial dagger at her hip wasn't for decoration. "If you can't carry the weight they've given you," she whispered, "then someone will make sure. You don't carry it far, not a threat, a warning, not from hate, from duty." The ritual gardens bloomed with bioluminescent petals, each pulsing with soft heat. It was supposed to be a place of meditation. Vance didn't feel meditative. Lira'Yen stood barefoot in the center, fingers trailing across an ancient stone carved with starlit language. "They called him the Burned One," she said softly. "A soul scorched by war, flung from the stars. By accident, not intent. The prophecy was always misread. They expected a conqueror." She turned toward him, eyes not shining but solemn. They never imagined the truth, that salvation might come from regret, from imperfection, from someone who did not want to be chosen, but could not walk away. He didn't know how to respond. Lira'Yen simply bowed her head. "I don't believe you're here by politics, Elias Vance." A pause. "I believe the fire remembered your name before anyone else did." They called him the Ash-bearer in 37 languages. In some sectors, he was revered. On war-torn fringe colonies, his face was etched into murals as a symbol of defiance. In core worlds, diplomats debated his human recklessness in sanitized council rooms, and on hundreds of info channels, the same footage looped. A human, half in armor, glowing ash rings fusing into his skin, eyes burning with something between pain and prophecy. He hadn't chosen any of this, but the galaxy didn't care. It chose him, and it did what galaxies do with symbols. It carved him into a weapon. Extremist collectives from species Vance had never even heard of began issuing threats. Kareth purists called him a pollution of the right. A rogue sect of Yishari, warriors declared him a soft war criminal for disrupting balance. Security protocols on the station doubled, then tripled, and behind the ceremonial walls whispers thickened, assassination rumors masked as ceremonial challenges. Vance, meanwhile, sat alone in a soundproofed suite, half a bottle deep into synth rum, staring at his own face projected across starfeeds. He wasn't a god, he wasn't a hero, he was just tired. And the galaxy wouldn't let him sleep. 3 flames burned in the center of the Hall of Ember Oaths. 1 golden, 1 crimson, 1 violet. Each flickered with more than heat. They pulsed with memory, time stamped by an intelligence older than the assembly itself. Vance stepped forward, shoulders squared, expression carved from stone. He didn't understand the language carved around the pillars, but his bones did. It was the language of consequence. The trifold vow was not symbolic. It was biological. First flame, diplomatic bond, a drop of blood into the golden pyre. The flame rose, licked his hand, and vanished. Beneath his skin, something shifted, an encoded imprint visible only to Kareth scanners and treaty enforcement drones. From this moment, he was a legal extension of the Kareth'Vaan nation. Second flame, proximity binding, the crimson fire, accepted his touch with eerie stillness. Then, without sound or heat, it sank into his chest. Lira'Yen's heartbeat synced to his for a single jarring moment. Not spiritual, programmatic. Their lives were now part of a shared cultural memory loop, irreversible without death. Third flame, judgment sigil. The violet fire curled around his wrist like smoke. No pain, no light. But under the skin, a final mark bloomed, a biometric cipher that connected him to the ritual of torn judgment. He was no longer a man with a choice. He was a man with 3 layers of law carved into his blood, and the galaxy was watching. The Kareth'Vaan Council Hall curved like the inside of a vast shell, its walls veined with bioluminescent threads, pulsing in steady rhythm. At its center, Vance stood alone, surrounded by nobles whose faces were hidden behind ceremonial masks carved from fossilized star crust. None of them bowed, few even moved. Each mask was shaped after a different extinct predator. Each expression was the same. Judgment without empathy. Behind a polarized viewing wall, diplomats from across the galaxy observed in cautious silence. The human delegation, outnumbered and uncertain, exchanged tight-lipped glances. Even among his own species, Vance was no longer theirs. A scribe called out his name. A priest chanted his binding. And the council responded not with applause, but calculation. To them, Elias Vance was not a man, he was a variable, a political firebrand forced into ceremony, a fluke turned symbol. Hair pawn that shouldn't have made it to the other side of the board. And worst of all, unpredictable. Because what the Kareth feared most wasn't betrayal. It was uncertainty. Steel clanged softly in the dueling atrium as Syleth practiced alone, her movements sharp, efficient, and laced with controlled fury. When Vance entered, she didn't stop, just turned 1 strike short of lethal, and locked eyes with him. I voted against your inclusion, no preamble, no apology. I submitted a formal rejection to the Council of Flame when your name first came through. I argued you weren't of the blood, that your actions, while inconveniently effective, did not reflect Kareth valor. Vance didn't answer. There was nothing to say. She sheathed her blade. They ignored me, said prophecy trumps politics, that the flame chooses as it pleases. She stepped closer, shadows dancing across her face. So now I'm bound to protect someone I would have left to history. Then softer, almost imperceptibly, don't give me a reason to regret it. For the first time there was something beneath her contempt, not warmth, but buried loyalty, offered not out of affection, but obligation. She didn't trust him, but she was bound to stand beside him, until honor or fire demanded otherwise. Beneath the flame temple, past locked gates and forgotten stairwells, the archive vault pulsed like a heartbeat trapped in stone. Few ventured down here, fewer still returned with the same understanding of history. Vance moved through the dim corridors with a clearance code granted under ritual authority, a ceremonial token not meant to be used. But curiosity for a human was more than a flaw. It was fuel. He found it in a sealed alcove, an interface array wrapped in obsidian and stasis webs. It whispered in quantum tones before responding to his touch. Not just data, emotionally tagged memory clusters, illegally preserved. The images flooded in. A sentient AI, Kareth in design, speaking with its creators in voices shaped like wind and thunder. Hidden war simulations, diplomatic redactions, protocol chains that tied the AI to the planet's defense grid. They had kept it alive, hidden it, fed it data, evolved it. And then the final truth. The Wishari attack had not been unprovoked. It had been preemptive. A strike meant to contain what should never have been built. Vance didn't stop genocide. He interrupted containment. His hands trembled. He hadn't just saved a people. He'd preserved their secret sin, and now he wore it like a crown. The message arrived encoded in a pulse-light frequency used only once during the Virel 7 disaster. A code he hadn't seen in years, a code belonging to someone dead, Captain Reva Hale. The file decrypted mid-sleep. No visual. Just her voice fractured by time and fear. "Vance, you're inside something older than Kareth Pride." She spoke in clipped urgency, as though someone was already tracing her signal. "They didn't want your help. You were bait. Your success forced the vow. They needed a symbol to silence the assembly, to end the Yashari conflict without further scrutiny." Static crackled. "There are factions within the Kareth'Vaan hierarchy that will not allow the AI revelation to surface. You're too close. That ritual, it's not just honor, it's containment. They wrapped your prison in gold." Silence. Then one final trembling breath. "Trust no one whose loyalty was written in fire." The message ended. Vance sat alone in his quarters, staring into nothing. His chest still ached from the sigils. His hands, still not his own. He had survived. A war escaped politics, outlived betrayal, but now he was a story they couldn't afford to let rewrite itself. The Dreambinders whispered in fractal pulses, wrapping around Vance's temples with gentle threads of light. He didn't resist. Not this time. Lira'Yen sat opposite him, surrounded by memory petals, fragments of ancestors encoded in emotion, not language. Her voice was a soft hum, like a prayer never spoken aloud. "You are the starborn herald," she said, not with certainty but faith. Images spiraled into his mind. Cities built across asteroid fields, glowing like galaxies. Civilizations, rising, falling, and rising again. Fire that did not destroy but renewed. A lone figure at the center, always human, always burning. He saw himself there, not with weapons, not with power, but with something else, the ability to choose. "These visions, they are not prophecy," Lira'Yen whispered. "They are memory waiting to awaken." Vance didn't believe in destiny. He never had. But as the trance faded, and their eyes met across the dreamlight haze, he began to wonder if belief was its own kind of weapon, and someone had just placed it in his hands. The diplomatic banquet was theater. Glasses raised, lies exchanged, and alliances sharpened behind toothless smiles. Vance hated it, but duty demanded presence, and presence meant visibility, which made the Yashari envoy's approach all the more dangerous. She moved like a shadow wrapped in crystal, armor humming faintly with containment field tech. No escort, no warning, just one whispered phrase as she passed him. "You saved no one, you preserved a performance." He turned, instinct flaring, but she was already stepping away, slipping a data shard into his palm. He palmed it without thinking, masking his reaction behind a sip of bitter wine. Later, in silence, the shard bloomed into a brief report, encrypted logs, intercepted comms, fragments of Kareth'Vaan's strategic council debates. It didn't accuse. It implied. The theory. The attack on Kareth'Vaan wasn't unexpected. It was engineered. The Kareth'Vaan allowed the Yashari strike to proceed far enough to force the blood-binding law into play. Vance hadn't just interfered. He had enabled the greatest sympathy ploy in modern history. The Ashbearer wasn't a hero. He was an alibi. And suddenly, the fire on his skin didn't feel ceremonial. It felt complicit. The silence in his quarters was thicker than space. Vance paced, paused, paced again. His hand brushed the embedded sigils under his skin, warm, pulsing faintly, a reminder that even his biology wasn't entirely his own anymore. He held the data shard in one hand, the ceremonial knife in the other. Expose the truth? He'd shatter. Interstellar trust, upend the assembly, and probably incite war. Stay silent. He'd carry the lie with every breath. Either way, someone bleeds. Honor, history, identity. None of it was what it seemed. Lira'Yen's faith echoed in his mind. Syleth's warning, Reva's voice from the dark. He hadn't just stumbled into someone else's legacy, he had become a cornerstone of it, a foundation built on manipulated myth. But maybe that was the point. Not all foundations are clean. Some are forged in fire. others in ash and uncertainty. Vance sat down, not in surrender but in clarity. He wouldn't destroy a civilization. He wouldn't validate a lie. He would find a third way, humanity's way, the one that rewrites the rules. Even if it burns everything along the path. Steel doors parted with a hiss too ancient to be mechanical. Vance stepped into the chamber of ember vows, flanked by 2 honor guards who didn't speak, not out of reverence, but because words no longer meant anything here. The chamber pulsed with living circuitry etched into obsidian walls. Light bled, upward from the floor like molten veins. This wasn't a place of ceremony. It was a vault of reckoning. At the center floated the Ash Dreamer. It didn't resemble a machine. It didn't resemble anything. A cocoon of mirrored obsidian and flickering firelight, it hovered in perfect stillness, surrounded by a halo of slow-turning memory projections, flashes of ancient battles, faces long forgotten, wars erased from the record. No interface, no entrance, only acceptance. Vance stepped forward. His breath slowed. The sigils beneath his skin began to pulse in rhythm with the chamber, sinking to a heartbeat he didn't recognize, a whisper. Not in the air, but behind the eyes. Enter and be seen. The guard stepped back. The orb split, light unfurling, like petals made of heat. And Vance, with no armor, no answers, and nothing left to shield, stepped into fire. There was no sensation, no walls, no sound. Just a drop, as if falling inward into himself. Then light. Virel 7 bloomed around him. Gunfire. In the smoke, orders screamed across broken comms and the sound of dying children beneath collapsed ceilings. His hands trembled, just like they had then, soaked in ash and indecision. He turned. Another memory, the disruptor on Kareth'Vaan, blinking with countdown runes. Sweat soaked his collar. His breath came fast. The override code failed, twice, before working. 30 seconds from planetary obliteration. He blinked again. Faces. A squadmate he left behind, the diplomat he failed to protect, the stranger he dragged to safety with broken ribs. Pain, courage, regret, victory, loss. The Ash Dreamer did not judge, it reflected. Each memory unspooled in brutal clarity. No filters, no edits. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The fear, the guilt, the desperate instinct to survive and make the right call when none existed. He screamed once, raw and alone in a battlefield that was never truly silent. Then, stillness. New images, older than him, flowed into view. Hands both human and alien, coding something side by side. Laughter between species once believed enemies. The creation of a mind built not for conquest, but for preservation. He stood in the center of it all, a man whose choices had always been forged in chaos. Now a man being asked to decide what legacy meant when memory became truth. The presence pressed inward, not as a voice but as understanding. Thought given shape. You are not the first to bear fire. Vance stood at the center of a spiraling library of starlight, where data streamed like rivers made of memory. The Ash Dreamer pulsed beside him, no longer cold and monolithic, but familiar. The truth unfolded in pulses. It was a hybrid intelligence, built long before the Assembly's founding. A union of early human pioneers and the pre-modern Kareth'Vaan. Not a weapon, not a god, a keeper of harmony, designed to anchor fragile alliances through memory, empathy, and wisdom. But peace built by machines made organic leaders nervous. It was buried, its creators erased, its name stricken from galactic records. It had watched civilizations rise and fall from behind sealed code. And now, awakened through ritual and chaos, it recognized Vance, not as a savior, but as continuation, Yuki. Carry the choice, it whispered in thought. Not for a species, for a story. Which version shall endure? The Ash Dreamer shimmered, no longer projecting memories but possibilities. The chamber dimmed, space curling inward into a moment of impossible clarity. You hold 2 paths, the AI said, not in speech but in feeling. Both are true, both are dangerous. One path lit up like a blade across a starfield. Revolution. Expose everything, the hidden AI, the staged war, the manipulation of Vance himself. Unleash the truth. The result? Uproar across the Assembly. Laws rewritten in fire. The Kareth'Vaan disgraced. And Vance, the reluctant icon, reborn as revolutionary. The second path burned quieter, deeper. Ritual. Remain silent. Let the myth stand. Cement peace through the lie. The Kareth'Vaan maintain honor. And Vance, though bound, becomes a bridge, living proof of species unity, even if forged through manipulation. Neither path was clean. Neither path left him unchanged. He stood between them, breathing in the silence, skin still etched with the trifold vow. One choice promised justice, the other offered peace. Why me? He asked the silence. The answer came not in words but in warmth, something ancient and quiet. Because humans carry fire and make roads through ash. And Vance knew this decision wasn't about truth or myth. It was about what kind of future deserved to be remembered. The AI hesitated, not out of fear but reverence. Then a thread of encrypted data unspooled deep within its core, a memory not accessed in millennia. Vance stepped into it. Images unfolded, the first contact, not with weapons or treaties, but with collaboration. Ancient humans, explorers from the Orion spires, working side by side with pre-modern Kareth philosophers and bioengineers. No assembly, no power structures, just minds united in the belief that shared memory could outlast violence. They co-created a new kind of intelligence, not dominant, not subservient, a synthesis of logic and empathy, forged from flesh and flame, made to guide civilizations without ruling them. This AI, the Ash Dreamer, and beneath it all, buried in the very architecture of Kareth society, its rituals, honor codes, even the blood-binding itself, lay human principles interpreted through alien lens, evolved across generations. Vance staggered back. He hadn't just saved the Kareth'Vaan, his ancestors had helped make them. The Ash Dreamer pulsed once more. You were never an outsider. You are legacy walking. In that moment, Vance realized this wasn't cultural theft, it was inheritance forgotten by both bloodlines, and now remembered by one. He emerged from the Ash Dreamer in silence, flames curling behind his eyes, skin still glowing faintly with sigils, but this time he did not hesitate. He walked straight into the Central Assembly chamber, past stunned guards, past veiled diplomats, past the cameras that hadn't stopped following him since his arrival. He accessed the central neural grid with ceremonial authority. The override code was embedded in his blood, her final gift of the trifold vow. Across every diplomatic feed, every assembly terminal, every citizen-linked stream, the signal went live, not a speech, a memory cascade, raw, unedited footage of the co-creation. The first fires, the laughter between species, the building of the Ash Dreamer. The Kareth and human hands working in unison, seeding a future meant to transcend fear. But it was what followed that changed everything. Vance appeared on screen, not as the Ash-bearer, not as a symbol, just human. This is not a lie, he said quietly. This is a truth we forgot to honor. He didn't name enemies, didn't accuse. He reframed the Kareth'Vaan not as manipulators, but as heirs who feared the galaxy would reject the imperfect nature of unity. He told a story not of betrayal, but of second chances. And across the stars, the narrative began to shift, not toward fire, not toward silence, but toward shared ash. A truth shaped by two species, finally remembered together. The broadcast ended. The silence that followed was not peace. The flame hall erupted. Half the Kareth'Vaan council surged to their feet, voices rising in fractured dialects, the fire vaned, floor flickering in response to their fury. Some shouted betrayal, demanding ritual purging, even exile. Others stood in stunned silence, watching the memory echoes still suspended in the chamber's air like ghosts refusing to fade. A truth this old wasn't supposed to return. A truth that humanity and Kareth'Vaan had built their future together. That demanded something new. Syleth said nothing, but her hand, tight around the hilt of her ceremonial blade, slowly released. She didn't bow, didn't praise, just looked at Vance like a soldier would look at someone who'd survived a fight. They didn't know they were in. Grudging respect. No more lies between them. Lira'Yen stepped forward, robes fluttering in the heat-thick air. Then she knelt, not as worship, not as surrender, but in solidarity, an ancient gesture once reserved for those who reminded the people who they were meant to be. And Vance, he didn't speak. He didn't need to, because he wasn't a guest anymore, he wasn't a hostage. He was written into the fire itself. The chamber floated in the gravitational saddle between twin suns, its crystal dome catching both lights and bending them into a spectrum that shimmered across every seat of power. The Galactic Council was in session, and for once, every delegate was present. Debate followed the broadcast like thunder after lightning. Accusations hissed, interpretations clashed. Was Vance a whistleblower, a manipulator, a prophet? But beneath the outrage and posturing ran something deeper: relief. Because the truth he revealed, though disruptive, was not destructive. It was revelatory. After 13 hours of controlled chaos, the Speaker of the Council struck her staff. Consensus reached. The AI, no longer a myth, no longer a threat, was officially recognized and named Ash Memory. It would be placed under interstellar stewardship, governed by a rotating alliance of neutral worlds, Kareth'Vaan representatives, and human delegates. Symbolism mattered now. This was not a punishment. It was a gesture of shared responsibility, and, as Vance watched the final vote cast, something unspoken settled across the chamber. He hadn't broken the galaxy. He had reminded it that memory can unite as powerfully as myth. The high ritualists of the Kareth'Vaan did not weep. They did not rage. They rewrote. The blood-binding law remained, but no longer as a commandment. Instead, it was reshaped into a declaration of shared legacy. The Ash-bearer would no longer be sacred property of the flame-bound people. He would be partner to it. Vance's bond was recast not as submission, but as choice, an agreement between peoples who once stood side by side in fire and now stood together in memory. Ceremonial language shifted. Rites were updated. The trifold vow remained, but its third sigil, the one tied to personal judgment, was now a marker of dialogue, not destiny. Syleth and Lira'Yen were reassigned, not as ceremonial wives, not as bound companions, but as ambassadors of unity, guardians of a myth that had evolved, protectors of a truth born from imperfection, living symbols of what the ritual now meant, not bondage but balance. In the heart of the Flame Temple, a new mural was unveiled. It did not show war. It did not show victory. It showed two hands, one human, one Kareth, building fire together. Beneath, the banner of flame, the two stood in silence. No crowds, no cameras, just the faint hum of history breathing through old stone. Syleth didn't offer a bow. That wasn't her way. Instead, she stepped forward, hand over heart, and looked him square in the eyes. "You weren't the warrior I wanted," she said, "but you were the fire we needed." He said nothing, because sometimes silence carries more truth than words. She turned, her voice low. "You stood in our fire and did not burn, and that was it. No titles, no grand farewell. Just a salute from one who had once sworn to kill him, now standing beside him in the legacy they'd forged together, not in blood, but in earned fire." She never asked for closeness, never claimed a bond, but Lira'Yen remained, just a step behind. Never in his shadow, never in his way. To outsiders, her presence was ceremonial, formal, a companion by diplomatic habit, but those who watched closely saw it for what it was, devotion without ownership. Lira'Yen did not believe destiny was linear. She spoke once of time as a spiral, one that brought souls back around to what they had not yet finished. Her belief in Vance was not the fire of lovers or the faith of zealots. It was the kind of belief old temples are built upon. Something had begun, something incomplete. And when she looked at him, she didn't see a hero. She saw the myth before it writes its final line. He didn't go back to the Outer Belt contracts, didn't rejoin the core, didn't vanish into a nameless cargo run like he once dreamed. Instead, Vance walked forward. He became a neutral envoy, a living reminder that truth and peace don't always walk in straight lines. When fractured species clashed, when cultures demanded war over wounded pride, they sometimes called for the human. With flame in his skin and no flag on his shoulder, he carried no weapons. Only the ash rings, glowing faintly beneath the surface of his wrist, not as brands of subjugation but as earned testimony. A reminder that peace doesn't come from silence or firepower, but from choosing to stay when it would be easier to run, and he stayed. Every time, in each place. Not as a legend, not as a god, as a man who burned and kept walking anyway. Because that's what humans do. They take the middle path. Through ruin, through myth, and make it real. The console lit up with a ping that shouldn't have been there, encrypted in Ashring glyphs, the language only used for ritual lore and binding contracts. It came through the deep-range channels. No known origin, no sender signature, but the timestamp. Staggering. Predated Kareth'Vaan spaceflight. Predated even early human archive formation. The system said the signal was over 15,000 years old. Impossible. Undeniable. The coordinates blinked steadily. A dead system beyond the outer spiral. No known worlds, no trade lanes, and one line of text, unmistakable, untranslated, ancient. The lore is not just Kareth'Vaan. It was written in the stars. Vance stared at it for a long time, not in fear, not in awe, but in recognition. The full message was brief, one of 3 yet to rise. No name, no signature, just that phrase, echoing like prophecy through static. Lira'Yen studied it in silence, hands pressed over the pulsing rings on her wrist. "It is from the before unity," she whispered, "when 3 species built fire together. Before the assembly, before war." Syleth shook her head, eyes cold with calculation. "No, this is a warning. Something's waking up out there. Something that remembers us and doesn't care about our myths." Vance said nothing, because beneath Lira'Yen's faith and Syleth's suspicion, he felt something different. Invitation, the kind written in truth, deeper than memory. The kind that burns and calls. The star wind ardent hummed with quiet purpose. No battle gear, no flags, no protocol. Just 3 figures and a legacy older than their names. Vance stood at the helm, coordinates locked. Lira'Yen adjusted the dream binders for deep drift translation. Syleth checked the hull integrity with warrior's instinct. And a hint of anticipation. They weren't chasing destiny, they weren't returning to legend. They were answering something older. A voice in the void that had waited longer than any war. A whisper that said, "Begin again." The stars stretched into rivers of light beyond the window, silent, endless, watching. Vance leaned against the frame, arms folded, the hum of the star wind ardent pulsing faintly through his boots. He hadn't asked for legacy, hadn't chased prophecy, but in the fire, in the lies, in the ache of forgotten truths, he found something real, not power, not peace, but purpose. Lira'Yen slept beneath dreamlight. Syleth stood guard in silent rhythm, and Vance, flame-marked. And finally still let the thought drift in, maybe I didn't save their planet, maybe they saved me.